Hello, I'm James Hollis, representing the Jung Society of Washington, and we've been asked to reflect together a bit on the subject of depression. So Radhika has kindly agreed to ask some questions, and I'll offer some responses, and we hope that this is helpful in some way in stimulating your understanding of depression.
Dr. Hollis, in your analysis, you prefer to use depressions rather than depression. In other words, you talk about depression in the plural rather than in the singular. Why is that?
Well, you know, depression's a word that we use to cover a whole range of human emotions, symptoms, and behaviors. And first of all, we need to differentiate what kind of depression are we talking about and what has been its trigger. For example, there are reactive depressions, which arise whenever we've suffered a substantial loss or substantial disappointment. We lose a love relationship or we lose a job. It's appropriate for the energy that was invested in that particular object or person or situation to, when it's released from that, to invert back into a person, and it often produces a reactive depression. Mourning is such an example when we lose a loved one. We would only call that pathological if it interferes too much and for too long in that person's life. And of course, that's a judgment call as to when mourning or reactive depression is in the realm of honest suffering, or when it's in the realm of some sort of pathology that's keeping a person stuck in his or her life. There are depressions that come from places we don't know. These are called endogenous depressions, and sometimes they respond to medications, sometimes they don't. And then thirdly, the most common usage of the word depression really arises from intrapsychic conflict, where there are parts of myself that are in opposition to other parts. Jung said once, all of our issues come from conflicts of duty. So if we have a duty to one value system and our own psyche wishes some other direction in our life, often these collide in a kind of counter-blocking form and produces a withdrawal of energy. One of the ways to think about depression is to see it as an autonomous withdrawal by our own psyche of its cooperation in wherever we're placing our energies at the moment. So from a therapeutic standpoint, we often look to see what is the issue that psyche is wishing us to address that has produced this withdrawal of normal life energy in its investments in the outer world.
I see. So it seems as if the uniqueness of depression makes it harder to diagnose and treat. Which factors or aspects should healthcare professionals as well as patients pay attention to facilitate a correct diagnosis?
Well, it's a good question. There are some very basic questions one looks for, such as one's outer life situation, to see, for example, if it is a reactive depression, if this has been something that's been chronic. Is it something that is situational? One also looks to one's lineage. Is this an issue that shows up repeatedly in the generations, suggesting, again, some biological thread that makes a person more prone to depression? We also know that almost everybody responds to the amount of light that the sun provides. So something like seasonal affective depression affects all of us to some degree, but it's certainly clear that there are some people that are hypersensitive to the light cues. So if one looks at graphs and portraits of seasonal affective depression, the farther north one goes in the northern hemisphere, the greater the incidence of seasonal affective disorder, because it's clear that the organism is wishing the light cues and it's not receiving enough, and so there's a diminution of energy. So I think the key is, of course, to examine the outer context of the person's life, the psychological history of that person and the family, and then also to then begin looking to intrapsychic conflicts to see where the person may be caught in some kind of internal dilemma that is producing a blockage of the normal flow of life's energy.
Dr. Hollis, the World Health Organization indicates that an estimated 350 million people worldwide are affected by depression, and evaluates that the picture could easily become even more serious in the coming years. How do you explain this high incidence of depressive disorder and the expectation of a worsening picture?
You know, there's so many factors that go into the psychological health of individuals and groups of people that it's hard to summarize them all. But I think certainly the experience of urbanization, the breakup of the traditional family, the loss of rooting experiences and a sense of homeland and place for many people has produced depression. We also understand how many social structures, religious values have lost some of their authority and have left people adrift, and they don't have clarity as to their marching orders or how they're to understand their world or find guidance in the world. Still another factor, which is far less tangible, is the erosion of tribal mythologies that help link people to transcendent orders of meaning. Where do I fit in the cosmos? How do I relate in a vital way to the world of nature around me? To what degree do I belong to somebody? Where is my home? Who are my people? And of course, this question of personal identity as well. So with the erosion of a society's capacity to in a satisfying way to address those needs of all people, often there's a withdrawal of energy, and it produces as a depression. And in some way you could say that's a kind of mythological crisis for the culture, just as there are mythological crises for the individual. And that is to say, the structures of belief are no longer serving that individual sufficiently. So the more social mobility, social chaos, and rapidity of change that we see, I think the more likely one is going to see both heightened anxiety and depression, because the former is obvious enough, but the latter is in what way do I have a sense of firm grounding, sense of identity, sense of place and belonging, and a sense of support systems in my life.
Dr. Hollis, do you believe that depression is becoming a characteristic of our generation? And is this an invitation to plunge deeper into the psychic world?
Well, it may very well be more diagnosable. I mean, depression has always been around. We have ample evidence of that, and throughout literature and scripture and so forth. But it certainly is an invitation to enter into one's interior space and say, what's going on here? Why has this come to me? We live in a generation and a culture that tends to want to throw medication at everything, rather than ask the question, why has that disturbing dream come to me? What does that symptom really mean? Why has this depression come? Again, why is my psyche not cooperating with the agendas that I'm trying to manage in my life? Now, those are perhaps difficult questions, but they're healthy questions, because they say I have to have a kind of firm accounting of my own psychological reality before I can begin to address what I need to do to move forward. And if, for example, my life situation, my career, my relationships, or whatever, are not in some healthy way supporting my spirit, my journey, then it's reasonable to be depressed. And rather than medicate that away or distract it away or numb it away in some fashion, the question really is, all right, what needs to happen in your life for you to be living more abundantly and for you to feel a deeper sense of life satisfaction? You know, rather than simply feel victimized by it, we have to say, what is the task that this is bringing to me at this point?
In your psychotherapeutic experience, what are the most common events in our lives that can lead to depression or to this invitation to look deeper?
Well, I think the most common that I have seen, and of course I operate predominantly as a Jungian analyst, is the disconnect or the discrepancy between one's roadmap and one's inner experience, between one's expectations around career, relationship, one's own self-development, and the reality that one experiences. And again, that often leads to a sort of detachment of libido or psychic energy from where it was invested before, an inversion of it. And of course, that can be a summons to renewal, redirection of energies, and so forth. Because at the time, we're preoccupied with a sense of disappointment, discrepancy, or loss that it represents. And so underneath every depression, there is a meaning. And the meaning is what I have to address in order to be honest about my life situation, but also to bring whatever resources I can to improve the circumstances of my life. Now, talk is cheap. That's not necessarily easy. Many times there are very deeply embedded issues for a person, or one suffered significant losses in life. That's a fact of life, and yet we have to somehow move on. In other words, it's not problematic that we have fear in life. It's problematic if we live a fearful life. So too, depression comes to us often as an unbidden guest and an unwelcome guest. But we still have to ask the question, why has it come? What is it asking of me? And what task is forming here for me to address over time? That's not something that's going to be solved by a few easy steps or, an overnight experience or, even medication. It's something that's going to require an alteration of consciousness. And in that is often how we grow, how we change, and how we move forward in our life. I think one of the most substantial changes in my life came out of a very significant midlife depression, which sent me for the first time into therapy. And as a result of that, I began addressing questions that otherwise were unaddressed. And we all live busy lives, we live engaged lives, we have lives where our roles tend to dominate who we are and how we think about ourselves. But underneath that, there's something that we call the human soul. And it has a life and a vitality of its own, and when it's offended or neglected, it protests. And those protestations are what we call symptoms. And so those symptoms are, in some way, are signs from the psyche that are calling us to a different kind of accountability, potentially to a metanoia, a transformation of consciousness. And out of that, frankly, can come new life.
In your books, you present the Jungian perspective of depression as a pit with a bottom. In other words, it's not an abyss or a bottomless pit. Are there treasures to be found at the bottom of the pit that the psyche actually leads us there?
Well, in a book called Swamplands of the Soul, I said frequently, with our best efforts, or sometimes the acts of the gods, or the behavior of others and their consequences that fall upon us, or the unintended consequences of our own choices, we fall into swampland places like anxiety and depression and so forth. And in every one of those visitations, there is a task, the addressing of which can move us toward meaning. It doesn't necessarily solve the outer circumstance. For example, if a person's had a genuine loss in life, they've lost a child or a marriage, or they've lost the career that they wished, or some aspect of their own physical health, a depression's normal and natural. And at the same time, I have to learn, how do I define my journey other than tied to that specific event or situation? We're not what happened to us. We're what is wanting to be expressed in the world through us. And without denying the reality of the loss or the disappointment or the situation, which would be its own pathology, we have to say, and what does that call me to in terms of new vigor in the direction of my own life? Because in the end, I'm responsible for how my life is working. As Jung said once, the smallest of things with meaning is always greater than the largest of things without meaning. And so we recognize that these situations, unpleasant as they are summonses to an accountability, to the care and well-being of our own souls. And it sometimes requires choices that are large and painful and threatening. And yet not to change is itself opposed to the directions and tendencies of the soul. I've often said, at times in life we have to choose between depression and anxiety, which doesn't sound like a very nice choice. But if we stay stuck in our lives, depression is a byproduct. You can count on that, because life is not being served. If we move forward in life, we may suffer greater anxiety because we're moving into new territory, into the unknown, into the uncertain. But we have to choose the path of anxiety because it's developmental. It leads to a larger life. And it's through that suffering that one often regains a sense of personal dignity and autonomy, just when we feel it's been taken away from us by the visitation of depression.
Dr. Hollis, you also talk about ghosts and hauntings. How do our internal ghosts contribute to the process of depression?
Well, I've used the metaphor of haunting simply as a way of talking about how the past is never really gone. It stays active in our lives. The largest experiences of our lives are charged with enormous amounts of energy. Therefore, the parent-child relationships are often profound in our sense of our self and our sense of world and our relational strategies and so forth. And strange ways we show that happening. For example, do I find myself often in compliant behavior or aggressive behavior, or do I wind up in avoidant behavior or whatever form? Often that's the replaying of earlier life experiences, which, because they're hovering in the unconscious, we're not aware that it's playing a role at that time in the conduct of our lives. And yet those same behaviors, which have a life and autonomy of their own, can often be inimical to or opposed to the fulfillment of my life. And so here I am in some way aligned against myself and I don't even know it. Or other times, if a person has a large complex sitting upon them, like a very powerful negative parent complex which denied permission, which was denigrating, they can live their entire life serving, in a sense, this life-oppressing value system, not realize how it's being in some way reinforced every day, that one is not able to find one's personal authority and live that in the world. And so you can see why when the soul suffers in that way, the byproduct is going to be depression. In other words, I could be living exactly as I'm supposed to be living, as approved of by my family of origin or by my culture, and I'm depressed. Now, that's not uncommon. And when people experience that, then the question really is, what does the soul want from you? And it sounds so simple in the abstract, because yet in the reality, it means that one is often forced against the very adaptations that were necessary early in life to choose a different path, which often leads to a sense of exile, of loneliness, a sense of rejection, and so forth. But it's in that path that one finds a larger life.
According to some psychologists, there's another side to depression. We are pathologizing the sorrows and natural frustrations of life and turning into diseases things that should be looked at and addressed in another way. What do you think of this view, and what do you think has failed in the current treatment of depression?
Well, yes, the paradox here is that just as we tend to over-medicate many of these emotional states, so we tend to pathologize them. And if you allow for just a moment here the concept to depathologize some of the pathology, you know, there are certain tendencies in modern psychiatry and psychotherapy to treat suffering as if it's something wrong. The human condition's full of suffering. It's honest. We experience attachment and we experience loss, attachment and loss throughout our life. Yeats wrote once, "We're in love, and love what vanishes, what more can be said?" And, you know, there's the human story. So to take medication or to have some kind of system or techniques to sort of rid oneself of that suffering is kind of spiritual and psychological dishonesty. And so it is with mourning. You know, it's not that mourning is pathological. We mourn in proportion to what we experience as the gift of the relationship. And we should mourn. Again, it's only pathologizing when it interrupts the rest of one's life journey. But to consider that something that has to be medicated away, in my view, is undermining the dignity of the human condition. I don't use the word happiness very often when I talk about these things, and it's not that I'm opposed to happiness, it's just that happiness is such a transient state. It's something that it can be so delusional and ultimately can trivialize a person's life. Real life involves moments of happiness, moments of great satisfaction and joy, and moments of sorrow and suffering and conflict and yearning. And that's the richness of the human condition. And there are times when one might say depression is a natural reaction of the organism when it's not being served or valued. And in the course of our lives, that's going to happen periodically. And rather than simply say, well, there's something wrong here with this person, we have to say, you know, this is a person suffering the human condition. I've actually known a few people in my life who had very strong religious indoctrination, who believed that they were sort of morally imperfect or not believers enough if they felt depression, which frankly was putting a complex of someone else's issues on top of their souls and not allowing them to feel what they already felt. And therefore their suffering was compounded by the fact that they felt guilty about the fact that they're not filled with joy from moment to moment. And ironically, I think in a way that's a trivialization of the human condition.
In your approach, crises, including depression, bring us a great invitation to life. Please tell us about this invitation to life. Though made in an intensely painful way, it seems like it can become something that's truly transformative.
Sure. I think any of us can very easily fall into the role of victim. And of course, in our lives, from time to time, we are victimized by the actions of others, the actions of fate, and so forth. And yet, the summons, it seems to me, of each human being is, I have to be accountable for this journey. I have to be the player who enacts this. And of course, the one person who's present in every scene of our long-running play, called our lives, we hope it's long-running, is ourselves. And so I have to say, no matter what's happened to me out there, I'm still responsible for the life I'm living. And I'm probably either by living a life of retreat or a life of service to the old stuff, replicating some of that victimage unwittingly in my life, and I'm called to accountability, and I'm called to change. Because the real question is not how do I make the world happy and how do I make myself happy? It's rather how do I live in a way that's meaningful? And how do I live in a way that gives depth and substance and purpose to my life? Because with that, virtually everything is bearable. And without that, nothing is bearable. Everything becomes trivialized in a way. And so, you know, I think it was Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, who said, the gods have ordained one solemn decree, that is through suffering alone that we come to wisdom, which is not an invitation to suffering, it's not enjoying suffering, it's saying, through suffering, we can come to a psycho-spiritual enlargement that approximates what we call wisdom. And the flight from that leads to a fugitive life, to an addictive life, to a life of denial, a life of numbing, or a life of victimage, none of which is a very attractive alternative, it seems to me. Well, we hope these thoughts and questions have had some capacity to provoke in you some reflections on your own life. I think one of the best ways to address the question of depression is to find a therapist or a person whom you feel confidence in, who can help you in this evaluation and help you find the questions that are important for you. It's not that others have answers for you. They're struggling with their own lives, but they may be able to support you and may be able to help you find the right questions that will open pathways for you, and therefore one can break out of that depressive circle that so often captivates an individual and keeps him or her stuck for a very long time. So we're hoping here from the Jung Society of Washington that this set of questions and comments has been somehow provocative to you, and we invite your responses. Thank you.